Hello and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're honored to have with us today Joyce Silverthorne, the head of the Tribal Education Department for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. Joyce is a great-grandmother of 5 who has worked with school systems both on and off the reservation for many years. She earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of Montana and is a Montana certified teacher and administrator. For 10 years, she served as a gubernatorial appointee to the Montana Board of Public Education, and she is currently a presidential appointee to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. She was a founding member of the Tribal Education Department National Assembly. Welcome, Joyce, and thanks for taking the time to be on the program.
Thanks.
Well, you've dedicated yourself to this issue for many, many years, an important issue for this community and for Indian people. Maybe, first of all, you could tell us a bit about why that's been your passion and why, in your view, it's so important for this community. Mm-hmm. Just a small question.
Just a small question, yes. Could we drop one of those minis while we're at it? Actually, it starts with my own education and watching the people around me and the kind of acceptance and reception that they were receiving in schools. And then as I had children, the concern for their well-being and their education and wanting them to be the best that they could be. And so how to do that became the driving force to getting into education. But once into education, it became all of the kids that I was seeing in schools and out of schools. We have an extremely high dropout rate. We have a lot of adults who weren't in education long enough to get a diploma. And many at that time hadn't even received a GED. So it kind of became a driving force in my life.
And when you think about that, you know, you mentioned seeing how they were received in school, how they were treated. Describe that a bit for us. What would have been some of the main problems?
I didn't realize when I started high school in St. Ignatius that it was the same location that the people who were going to boarding school with the Ursulines were coming as they left 8th grade. They were coming into the high school. And the Indian people that I started classes with didn't stay there very long. There were only a handful of us that continued on through high school. And I wasn't one of the ones who completed high school. And part of it is a absence of anything that reflected us in the school setting. There were no acknowledgments that this was a reservation. There was no acknowledgement of language or culture or even people who are darker that were working in the schools. There were even down to the janitorial positions. There weren't Indian people.
And you went to high school in St. Ignatius.
I did.
Yeah. Were you there in anywhere close to the time when Clarence Woodcock was going in?
I had a wonderful opportunity. I got to take shorthand with Clarence Woodcock.
Wow.
And I didn't understand why he could take shorthand at 140 and I was struggling to get 80.
Wow.
As a multilingual person, he was already familiar with transitions from sound systems and writing different ways to make the same sound, and he had a tremendous advantage that I don't think we understood at that time.
Well, he was brilliant by any standard.
By any standard.
Yeah. To be valedictorian in St. Ignatius and be from a traditional family in that time must have been pretty remarkable.
And he was the idol for a lot of us.
Well, that's wonderful, and that gives us a good transition actually into what I'd like to explore a little bit now, which is the traditional cultural education that, of course, the tribes have maintained for millennia, and which predated all these various different non-Indian educational systems that have come in since. Maybe could you describe a little bit about that for us and what some of the differences are between that educational system and what has come in since?
When we look back in time before the coming of the European, education consisted of raising children to be the best people they could be in their setting. much like it is now, but the setting was very different. And that setting had to do with being able to survive in the outdoors, had to be able to get along in a communal group, and had to be able to demonstrate skills and knowledge as they grew up. That skills and knowledge was passed from adult to child in many different ways. The structure of families was much more of an extended family. People in the family took responsibility for young folks, and they were taught the responsibilities of their gender, of their role in the community, and they were encouraged to develop skills that they showed a knack for.
And all of a sudden, 1860s or so, a very different system comes in. And it was the first non-Indian educational systems here were introduced by the Jesuits and the Sisters of Providence, is that right?
Yes.
And so part of their agenda was an inherent invalidation of Native cultural and educational systems, wasn't it?
An inability to understand the value and the knowledge that the people they came into contact had. The ability to read the land and what it meant and the changing of seasons and the environment wasn't something that the sisters brought with them. And as they saw it, they didn't understand it as an education. And so there was devalued. Believed that many things that are in print are the only real knowledge, and this was an oral society that passed on a tremendous skill for retaining knowledge, as well for everybody, as well as an oral history, oral education system.
That's fascinating, and you know, you mentioned that they didn't have kind of the eyes to see what was in front of them, and they in many ways regarded what they were doing as introducing civilization to the savages, isn't it?
Of course.
Yeah.
Thinking that they were doing the best for them.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading, one of the great Jesuit historians actually is a guy named Francis Paul Pruka, and one of the conclusions he reached after a lifetime of work was that much of the greatest damage done to Indian people was done by people with the best of intentions.
Yes.
It's a sobering.
Unfortunately, that repeats itself through history.
Yeah, for sure. And so the Sisters of Providence, the Ursulines, the Jesuit fathers, they introduced quite a large educational infrastructure into the St. Ignatius area, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And there were Indian people who came from many different areas that were here to come to school. There were also non-Indians that began to come to school later.
And as a reminder to viewers, this is after the Treaty of 1855. This is 1860s, it begins, but really develops in the 1880s, doesn't it?
Right.
Okay.
Comes of age.
Comes of age.
And it begins to receive funding from the federal government.
For a period of time.
Yes.
And this is interesting to me because it's really only in full swing for around a decade or so, isn't it? From mid 1880s to mid to late 1880s,
I think it was
1890s.
in force for much longer. It may have been at its heyday for about a decade,
right.
But its impact and its ongoing structure in education existed until 1972. So it was a slow demise.
Right. And yeah, so it's here for a long time and having all kinds of different impacts. I remember that one time Roy Bigcrane and I were interviewing Father Dumbeck, and he was about 96 or something at the time. Very lively and a wonderful guy in a lot of ways, but we were kind of struck by the bluntness with which he described the Jesuit goals in education. And he talked about the establishment of these boarding schools because he said when kids went home, well, then they'd talk Indian all the time, he said, and they had to put a stop to that. So what about that? I mean, what about the impact of these boarding schools? What have you found?
The impact of boarding school is tremendous. Whether it was at the Ursulines or whether the young people were sent to one of the other many boarding schools that were available. The 100% impact is that they separated parent from child. Some as young as 6 years old, some I understand may have been younger. And that change in how we educate our children had immeasurable impact and damage. Because they didn't substitute something that made as much sense, that was as intact, and that was as whole as what they were tearing apart.
Right. And they specifically, at least some of them, I've heard some differing stories about language in these boarding schools, but from at least some elders, we've been told stories that they were punished when they were caught speaking Salish.
Language wasn't allowed, ceremony wasn't allowed, the practicing of culture and spirituality was not allowed. And that's universal.
Yeah.
And those, they were actually directives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to not allow. And in the best interest of the people who made those edicts, they thought they were doing a favor. That if the child would lose its Indian heritage and be changed to be a, quote, better person, a civilized person, that they would be better off. And what in fact they did was, for many children, the English language that they acquired may or may not have been an academic English. They did acquire English, but it wasn't necessarily the English that would get them through a school system, or that would take them well through their lives. And so the impact of the language loss, I still believe is at least a component of our continuing achievement gap today.
That's so interesting. And you know, I think I read somewhere that there were about 320 Indian children in the boarding schools in St. Ignatius during the 1890s, during that heyday period, and more after. I mean, there were fewer, but continuing numbers afterwards. But I guess that was the height. But I'm still struck by something, because the boarding schools are often, I think, pointed to when we talk about the history of language loss and cultural loss on the reservation. And yet, if you talk to almost, I don't know, must be upwards of 90% of elders that I know who came of age before 1910, but after the boarding schools were established, and I'd say upwards of 90% of them were fluent in at least one of the languages.
Or more.
Or more.
Most of the families that I've talked with as we are doing assistance to help people be teachers of language, most of them talk about their families having multiple languages.
It's interesting because, I mean, it suggests that the Jesuits may have tried to get these kids to abandon their native languages, but they didn't succeed.
They didn't, and people literally went underground. They literally kept it a secret that they were fluent speaking. And they, it creates an interesting dynamic between parent and child, or adult and child. And the child that becomes the more fluent English speaker becomes the translator for the adult. And yet when they're away from non-native people, they're in their own language. And so it creates a interdependence that didn't exist, and a different kind of balance between adult and child.
That's interesting, and probably all kinds of internalized invalidation of their own cultural heritage too. Is there some of that?
Can you imagine trying to hide who you are so that you're accepted in the community? That's not going to be good for anybody. No, definitely not. And we'll be continuing our conversation with Joyce Silverthorne about the history of education and about current education efforts on the Flathead Reservation in one moment. Please don't go anywhere.
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Joyce Silverthorne, the head of the Tribal Education Department for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. And Joyce, before the break, we were talking a bit about the history of education on the reservation and the history of acculturation efforts in many respects. And you were describing a bit about the impact of the boarding schools within the communities, Salish, Pondere, and Kootenai communities here. And after so many decades of the boarding schools, the next thing down the pike was the Flathead Allotment Act and the opening of the reservation. Can you describe the impact of that within the field of education?
The Allotment Act was intended to make farmers of Indian people, and they would better use smaller acreages of land, and that there would be surplus of land left over that was then available. And so that outside of the reservation area was the available land. There were certainly disputes about where those boundaries were. There were legal issues about how the boundaries were established. But in all, when it was all done and we began to see the next phase after the allotments, it became obvious that there was going to be an opening of the reservation. Opening of the reservation, the whole homesteading, happened not only here but in other places as well. But in this valley, with its rich bottomland, with the beautiful scenery, with the abundance of water.
The irrigation project?
The irrigation project that was already in planning and in process. The whole thing comes together to make this a very appealing place for farmers, for non-native people to come. And that as they opened that reservation, the advertisements that were presented to the people who were interested in becoming a homesteader were as misleading as the information that was provided to the people who were among the tribe after the signing of the reservation and the
Hellgate
history,
Treaty.
the treaty, and even the Allotment Act. We were still in a process of becoming farmers, and not very well. It was much more of a sedentary life that didn't fit well with our history, our tradition. And so it wasn't an easy transition to make.
Yeah. And overnight then, in 1910, all of a sudden, tribal people are a minority within their own reservation. Or maybe not overnight, but close to that.
I don't know about it was a minority, but it was quickly, at least people who came had more of an opportunity for power. That the market economy that came with them was very familiar to them, where it was not to the tribes. And so their ability to interact outside of the reservation and with other people in the Northwest was what's much easier for them than it was for the tribal people. And the ability to put food on the table changed. It was less of a gathering and hunting, and it became much more of a store and a bill. And many people lost their land for the bills at a store.
Right. So before the opening of the reservation in 1910 to non-Indian settlement, the main non-Indian educational institutions that tribal kids were put into were these boarding schools. There were some
mission
government
schools.
There were a couple smaller government schools, I guess, in our Lee and maybe briefly or something like that.
With the coming of people into the reservation, we began to see smaller schools. Yes.
Okay, you're talking
Community
after
schools.
1910, or before 1910.
At about 1910.
I see, but the public school system then starts after 1910, doesn't it?
Well after 1910.
Well after 1910.
That we don't see them really becoming public schools for a number of years yet. And as the CCC camps in the 30s began, we see a real establishment of the community schools.
I see. So what happens, what's the experience in these schools, in these community schools and then the public schools later on? And how does that compare with the experience of Indian kids in the boarding schools?
Well, to begin with, these schools weren't designed for the Indian children. These schools were designed to be for the non-native people who had moved into the area. And so there was very little interaction. And it was only as Indian people began to realize that the kids that came out of that school were able to get along better in that community than were the children out of the mission school. And so there was something different, and they wanted the better for their children. There were a few of our elders whose parents insisted on them going into public school. That was true throughout the state. And in the 40s, there was actually a lawsuit in Montana where the school district didn't believe they had a responsibility to educate Indian children. And the lawsuit was determined that yes, in fact, they did. That children,
they did have that responsibility.
Indian children were members of the state, just like the other children, and that as a public education, they had a right to come to school as well.
You know, I was surprised when I looked over some of the statistics for the boarding schools that as late as the 50s, there were still something like 50 or 70 kids in boarding schools in St. Ignatius at the Ursulines. So as you mentioned in the first half of the program today, that legacy continued for decades.
For a very long time.
Yeah.
We still have parents of children that are in school, grandparents of children that are in our schools today that were in the Ursuline school.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the CCCs in the 30s, a federal program that that began providing some kinds of educational opportunities for young Indian people that didn't exist before. There were also some other federal programs that kicked in the 30s. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
The whole New Deal came in, Indian Reorganization Act, and the tribes became a chartered organization adopting the leadership style of the United States. And that leadership style was to have a group of people who were elected. We had a constitution established.
Right.
Constitutions were modeled all after a master constitution. And so you'll move from one reservation to another and you'll find the wording almost identical.
Almost the same, yeah.
Somebody changed the name of the tribe, but then not a lot of anything else changed.
Right.
And
eliminated the traditional chiefs, but
eliminated traditional, hereditary.
Right. But in some ways, it did give the tribes a footing from which they could begin to rebuild their assertions of sovereignty, didn't it? Or do you disagree with that?
No, I'm not so sure about that.
Okay.
They were always sovereign. And I think that's one of the hardest things we're finding as we begin talking to teachers to help them understand that this is not something new. That this is not something that tribes are just dreaming up. That this was always the case.
Yes.
The leadership.
But all I was talking about was giving them a platform from which they could assert that sovereignty. In other words, to engage with the federal government, to make claims, to demand funding for things. I mean, before the Indian Reorganization Act, there was just the BIA and that was it, wasn't it?
Well, giving them a platform. I think that the federal government designed the platform.
True.
And the system worked with that platform.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was a tremendous advantage for Indian people to have to make that transition because they had to learn an entirely new way of governing, a new way of seeking support.
Just to be clear, I don't mean to be coming off as a big champion of the Reorganization Act and not recognizing the many ways that it did cultural damage.
Well, and we could talk about the Indian Reorganization Act a lot longer because I think it is a piece of history that is not well analyzed even yet.
very complex.
Very complex.
With very
Major
complex
changes.
ramifications for tribes.
Major changes.
Major changes. Okay, well, there are a few more things that we'd like to get to in the history, but we may have to touch on those in the next program. But really, beginning in the 30s, the slate of federal programs begins coming into play, doesn't it? And,
yes, it does.
maybe at the start of the next program, we can talk a bit about the Johnson-O'Malley Act.
That would be wonderful.
And that hopefully will give us a good lead into talking about the opportunities and challenges that your department is engaging with now.
That'd be wonderful.
Great. Thanks, Joyce, again for being with us today. And I'm happy to say Joyce Silverthorne will return with us next week for another half hour to talk about what her department is dealing with now and in the future. Thanks for being with us. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for the show, please email us at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.